This is something that in some way or form I'm sure you have learned about before, but we're going to try to go into maybe some details that you're not as familiar with. So that's the plan. We will see how that goes. So slavery has been the cornerstone of the British Empire for quite some time. Basically what the British Empire was kind of based around. And so because of that, every colony is going to have people whom are enslaved at some point in the British Empire. Every colony, especially like your southern colonies that had like the rice plantations, and you're going to see it even all the way to the northern colonies in Boston. In fact, one of the earliest documents that kind of okays, for lack of a better term, slavery comes out of Massachusetts. And so it is not just a southern thing at the time, but it is much more, for lack of a better term, it's much more cost efficient in the South at this era than it would have been in the southern or in the northern colonies to do so. And so that is why you're going to see more of a leaning in the South. Also, you also see that what's going to be significant is by bringing in, I thought this was a great point that your book made. In fact, it was so good I wrote it down and I added it to my APUSH content because I thought it was just kind of a unique perspective, is that by bringing in these slaves from Africa, the colonists identified them all as basically one unit. I think that's one of the reasons in the United States a lot of people have this concept. I think it derives from that Africa is a country, if you will, and not a colony. Africa is a continent. There we go. And not a country, is because of this idea of all of the slaves who came from Africa being part of the same group. And you think about like how diverse, even like North America, which is significantly smaller than Africa, how diverse our cultures are between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And, we are all relatively newer societies, if you will. And so to group all people of African descent in African slavery at that time is really kind of, well, slavery is ignorance. So I guess it fits the mold here, but it's kind of an ignorance actually of them and kind of not acknowledging them as individual people, but more as them, as that group mentality. The other thing that I thought was interesting to point out here, and this was the one that I saw and I read, I'm like, that's a very interesting point. Not only did it serve as a way to look at us versus them for many of the white Americans, but it also is going to unify white Americans. And I'd never really thought about that point in that way, because if you think about, when we use the term white, that group of people has some very diverse backgrounds and from countries and places that really didn't necessarily get along. And so it's kind of interesting that color here becomes a unifying characteristic. It's not to say that hadn't happened before, but I just thought that was such an interesting point because it really melges into this whole kind of society of white. And if you've never listened to 1619, which is a really good podcast, and there's a book as well that centers on kind of slavery coming into the U.S. and how it changes, how it shapes U.S. culture, it really does a good job of kind of showing how that whiteness was kind of a unifying factor. It's kind of an odd concept if you think about it, Some of you, no matter your ethnicity and where it falls in, hey, Shakoya's not here because she was talking about like her Native American ancestors the other day. But, a lot of times we kind of lose that, and it really has become rather in our society, I should say, more about color than about ancestry. And it was funny because she was talking about having family members who were Wampanoag, and I had family members who were from a different Native American tribe, and I'm sure some of the rest of you have kind of the same thing. And, we lose that part, but we keep the idea of color. So anyway, that's a whole kind of long intro, but good timing. Welcome, Lily. Good to see you.
Amber, remind me before we go to mention about that with the testing for next week. So I don't want to forget to tell you. All right. So slavery is more than a labor system. It's more than just a labor system. In fact, the idea of slavery is going to influence almost every aspect of what develops in these British colonies. So coming into this a little bit, these enslaved people that came to the American colonies, I always forget that I can't control that with that. Enslaved people that came to American colonies, large numbers of them started coming, backing up a little bit. In 1660, the English monarch Charles II realizes that there's a lot of money in the slave trade. And so he creates a group called the Royal African Company. This is actually their seal. This is their seal of that company. And the king, Charles II, yes. And this company is formed for the purpose of trading enslaved people and also other goods from Africa. So that is his whole purpose. And of course, royal, why? Because he's the king. And so interestingly enough, Charles puts his brother James II in charge of this. And James is going to kind of oversee this company until James becomes king. And when he does, he's going to pass it off to someone else. And so the royals kept a very tight hand on this because it was so profitable. Economics is a huge aspect here. All right, so under both of these kings, both Charles II and his brother James II, the Royal African Company had a monopoly. And so they were able to transport enslaved people to the English colonies from the years 1672 to 1713. Between those years, they're going to bring over 125,000 captives from the African coast. 125,000 captivated people. Now, they lost in death on the transport. If you do not know, about 1 in 5 people die, and that's the case here. 20% of the people who they took are going to die in the passage. And so the Royal African Company has this monopoly. However, that's going to come to an end for them in 1689 because other English merchants began to realize that this was very profitable. That this was a very profitable thing. And so they're going to kind of jump on this idea of, hey, if they trade slaves, they make money. And so with this, you're going to see a great increase in the number of people that are being transported from Africa through this brutal Middle Passage, and most of them will end up in the West Indies, particularly in Barbados. And so Barbados is very significant when you study kind of the history of the development of slavery. And it is right here, kind of south of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And that island kind of becomes the center of that. A lot of things that would happen there, the process that I refer to, and I don't know if I came up with this or if I read it somewhere. I'm sure I probably read the actual term somewhere, so I don't want to take credit for it. But the idea of de-Africanizing these people that were being taken from their land. And so they wanted to take away their culture, and they wanted to take away their language, and change their names. And so the idea was to disconnect them to Africa.
So with Barbados like the center of import?
Yes. And so it kind of becomes that spot, if you will. And so these merchants from London and Bristol and Liverpool, all these English merchants, are basically just getting very rich while they are trafficking humans who are enduring a nightmare of misery, privation, and dislocation. So it is definitely at the loss of a whole entire group of people. So enslaved people, they made it their goal, and it's really amazing to see how resilient they were, that they would try to adapt to their new life, to their new status. And so they formed communities that were very tight-knit amongst themselves. And it's interesting because you have to understand, like, if, let's say that these 3 people were taken from the same community in Africa, they would separate you. Like, they did not want you around other people whom you might be affiliated with, because that way you would be connected to kind of the old world, if you will. It's all about this new identity that would be about your subservience. And so to do that, they would try to separate you from anyone or anything who might be familiar. That might be familiar, I should say. And so these groups, amongst themselves, amongst these newly found families, you would find that they would often start to practice certain African customs, including particularly healing techniques, things that came from the motherland that were known for different types of healing. And so with this, that development of family and community was extremely important in the enslaved people in the Americas, because it was a way they could respond to the trauma. Other people dealt with the trauma of their situation by resisting their conditions, whether they are going to defy or run away. You see that as well. But one of the things I read kind of recently was comparing like this dislocation and even the re-identity of family to people who were Holocaust victims who kind of do the same thing. And so you see this need to connect and to rebuild and to try to restructure. And I think that it's definitely trying to bring a silver lining to a very dark cloud, to say the least. So continuing with this school of thought, these communities that develop are referred to as maroon communities. They're referred to as maroon communities. And a lot of times these maroon communities are communities of escaped people. And so they would find other escaped people and they would kind of form their own little group. The most prominent maroon communities are in a specific area of Jamaica that actually were successful in keeping the British away from them. And so when we talk about this, the Americas, we're not just talking about the United States. This is kind of written all over the Caribbean here. So a little bit about Georgia before she became English. Georgia before she was English. So the first African slaves present in the United States actually arrived in the present day United States, I should say, actually arrived in 1526. And it was with a Spanish settler or a Spanish leader by the name of Lucas Vasquez de Avalon. And I'll write his name for you. And so Lucas Vasquez de Avalon is going to bring the first group of people of African descent and slavery onto the Carolina or Georgia coast right in there. This group is very significant. You don't hear a lot about them. In fact, we talk more about 1619, when the White Line arrives in Jamestown, which we will discuss in just a little bit. However, this group is very interesting because what happens is they actually rebel successfully. And they basically go to live with Native Americans. They live with the indigenous people. And so they even come back, this group, together with the natives, and they destroy the Spanish colony. And so it's kind of interesting because you don't see a lot of this, but you do see it here. And so it was a story that they destroyed the Spanish colony where they had been held prisoner, along with the help of the natives, who probably weren't very happy about the Spanish being there either. So we do see some success here. Georgia was founded a little later in 1730s, and there were powerful financial backers there who definitely did not have a problem with Georgia having slavery. However, they do not concentrate on slavery there at first. Their major goal with Georgia was to protect South Carolina, because South Carolina was very financially fluid. And so they wanted to protect that. And so Georgia was more the buffer colony, as we talked about in our last discussion. And we talked about how the people there were mostly people in prison for debt. And so despite the fact that it was there, it is not very successful. So Spain, they're down in Florida, and they make offers to slaves of their enemies that if they will revolt and escape, they can come and live in Florida, and they will let them be free. And so you see that tension kind of brooding there between the English and the Spanish, where they do promise them freedom. Despite the agitation, you don't see a lot of that. And in fact, it is not until the Spanish and the Georgia colonists were fighting in the 1740s. If you took a push, you may remember the War of Jenkins' Ear, talking about the War of Jenkins' Ear, where the guy's ear gets cut off and they send it back to the King of England, like as a protest. But until that happened in the 1740s, there were a lot of arguments for trying to open the colony to slavery. The reason is because of the rice plantations that they wanted to start there, and the feeling that if they had more slaves there, that it would work well.
Were the Spanish over
No,
there?
the English. The Spanish were like promising any slaves that if they would escape the colonies, that they could come there and that they would be free. But the English are wanting to start growing rice in Georgia now that they have it. And to do that, they know they need, or they feel that they need, I should say, free labor. So Georgia's proprietors basically relent in 1751, and they're like, okay, you can have slavery here. And so that is shortly before the French and Indian War. And with that, the African slave trade is going to grow substantially in Georgia. And so we do eventually see that it's there. So let's talk about Florida a little bit. Let's talk about Florida. Now, I love the old Spanish forts. Like this one is St. Augustine in Florida, but when I was in Puerto Rico in, I think like maybe 2015. No, it had been before then. It's before Micah was born. So like 2013, when I was in there, it amazed me how much, of course, the forts all look alike. You know, they're all very, very similar, these old Spanish forts, and I think that's kind of neat. But anyway, 1565, this is St. Augustine. The site already had Native Americans there whose ancestors had migrated from Cuba. So if you know that Florida is only 90 miles off the coast of Cuba, and in fact, when I went to Puerto Rico, we were on a cruise ship, and on our cruise ship, we could see Cuba off the coast there, and I thought that was kind of cool to see it. Because you already had people who had immigrated from Cuba there into Florida. So the Spanish introduced African slaves into Florida after they claimed the area in 1513. The Spanish settlement was very small, so they didn't have a lot of people. They didn't have many slaves. And so it really wasn't until 1539 that De Soto is going to arrive there in Florida. And we're going to see St. Augustine is going to be founded in 1565 specifically. So the Spanish promised freedom, as we said earlier, to slaves who would come from South Carolina, eventually Georgia, anything they could do to make the or the British colonies, I should say at this point, less stable. That was kind of the goal. And the slaves, however, one of the things they had to do to be free in Spain, well, Spanish Florida, is they had to first of all convert to Catholicism. Because remember, religion was a really big deal back then, as far as in the government of the country. So you had to declare yourself a Catholic, and you had to agree to serve in the Spanish militia. However, to add to that, though, if you did those two things, you could also become a Spanish citizen. And so full rights, it's very different than the treatment that we see by the British, to be fair. So full rights. By 1730, there was a famous black settlement that was known as Fort Mose. And this is Fort Mose here. It was established and it was later fortified. There were two known Fort Mose sites. In the 1830s, the men helped defend St. Augustine against the British. And then, or the 18th century, I'm sorry, I said 1830s, but that would be the 1700s. I looked at it wrong. So they helped defend St. Augustine there. And then also we see another Fort Mose site a little further down the road, but it's known to be basically, and this is a quote from the text, it's the only known free black town in present-day southern United States that a European colonies government sponsored. So we do see for people of African descent who had been brought to the New World, they do have, after being wrongfully taken, they do have a right to become citizens of Spain. And so we do see some rights restored for this very, very small group. The second Fort Mose, however, was formed in the 1800s, and it was a lot of marsh and wetlands. And so it was not as easy to maneuver, we will say. But anyway, moving on. In 1763, the British get Florida because they defeated France in the French and Indian War, and they basically got everything west of the Mississippi River. And so for that short amount of time, even though the Spanish had been defeated, they really didn't mess with much. In fact, in Florida, like as far as the British here left St. Augustine, they didn't mess with the residents of Fort Mose, which is kind of surprising since they probably viewed them as escaped, but they left that alone. A lot of the Spanish do manage to transport themselves. They go to Cuba because it's a Spanish colony, but they do that more out of fear for what the British will do. But the one who stayed were not really messed with. So as the British start to develop more and more plantation agriculture, you see the percentage of slavery rise from about 18%, get this number, to 65% by 1783 in Florida. So it goes from an 18% number to a 1783. Now, not to downplay that number by any means, but to give you a little explanation, Florida also didn't have very many people, period. So you're not talking about bringing in millions of people, but it still shows this new emphasis that's been given to slavery, for sure. Shows a transition in their view. All right, so a little bit about Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay. So the first African ship that arrived in British North America is going to be in August of 1619. And I love the podcast 1619. I love the girl who does it. She just has such a brilliant voice, and it is fascinating. But so it's kind of the history of slavery in the U.S., and then it goes into the history of rights that are repressed, and so it's very, very good. But the name of the ship was the White Lion. It's a Dutch ship that was ran by a guy named Robert Rich, just if you're kind of curious, and it docked at Old Point. And what's interesting is it was not where it was supposed to go. It was actually misplaced. And so they had 20 African people on board. It wasn't like hundreds. However, sometimes the things that change our history the most do start with just a small few people. These were the first people of I was going to say the first involuntary slaves on the New World, but then the Native Americans, you can't really discredit how they were treated, even though it wasn't slavery. So these were the first people of African descent who were brought in as slaves in the British part of North America. So to be fair. All right, so these people were captured from Mongolia, if you're just kind of curious. And what had happened is because they kind of landed there by accident, they offered Jamestown, they said, well, what have you got? And so Jamestown traded provisions with the ship. And these individuals initially were treated essentially how indentured servants were, which I found that very interesting. I did not know that. In fact, they served for like 7 to 10 years, and then they were free, which, not that that's great, because they didn't exactly choose that passage. However, that's much better than what we're going to see coming afterwards. So when did the slave laws get put in place? Those were passed in 1641 in Massachusetts and in 1661 in Virginia. And that is going to dramatically change the system even for the worst. So some early enslaved Africans were able to earn that freedom, as we said, by fulfilling work contracts. Oftentimes they also had to convert to Christianity, although they didn't have to really give like some deep sign of conversion. They just had to say, yeah, that's cool. I'm good to go. So anyway, historians show evidence that suggests attitudes were much more flexible in the 16th century Virginia, as we said, than they would be just a few years later. So by 1649, there were 300 people of African descent in the colonies. By 1690, there were 950. And so by the time yes, 1649, 300, 1690, 950. However, between those two time periods, the legal distinctions, the laws that were put in place to distinguish between white indentured servants and non-white indentured servants developed into the lifetime inheritable chattel slavery that we're going to have for Africans in the New World, unfortunately. And so this leads us to the Carolinas. All right, so in the early 18th century, 1700s, enslaved Africans were difficult to acquire in the colonies because most were sold to the West Indies. And if you think logically, the West Indies is kind of along the way, right? So if you could trade, if you were a business person, and you could trade in this area versus having to go all this extra distance, logically, you would make more money in this area. And so that is where we see at first, one of the things that accounts for the slow growth of slavery in the New World is the fact that it just wasn't as available at first. But Charleston is going to be the first major center of African slavery. Why is that? Well, the colony was mainly founded by planters, and they had this overpopulation of English sugar on Barbados. And they had these, because they were overpopulating it, they had basically too many slaves there at that point to be economically profitable. And so they were moving some of the slaves they had from Barbados to kind of place them in another location. And so they're going to move them to Charlestown or Charleston today. And so here they are going to meet these new plantations, and they're going to transform into growing things like rice and indigo, which become very valuable. The largest percentage of slaves in any colony are going to be in the Carolinas, and actually the largest percentage of people in slavery at the time the Civil War started was also in South Carolina. Interesting side note, South Carolina was the first state to do what? Secede. But it's not about slavery, right? But that's none of my business. Yeah. But it's kind of interesting that South Carolina is the first state that secedes. If slavery is not connected, that is a very interesting thing. Who's the second? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Mississippi was second. I'd have to look up that statistic, but I'm almost positive that Mississippi was in January of 1961. Let's see, let's just order of seasons. It is Mississippi. Love when I'm right.
Yeah.
All right. So, and guess which state has the second largest number of slaves before the Civil War? Interesting statistic, right? The statistics don't mean anything. So I digress. But anyway, I think that kind of shows why that with those systems being so entrenched, it starts entrenched here. Now, Mississippi obviously comes a little bit later because it doesn't even exist yet. But it starts here with South Carolina. It starts here with what you see in Virginia. And why doesn't Virginia grow bigger than it is? Well, because they learned that it wasn't as profitable, because everything comes back to money oftentimes in these situations. It really does. But anyway, so moving along. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen in New England. In New England, slaves, both African and Native Americans, are going to make up a smaller part of the New England economy. Now, I know I focus a lot on economy because it's one of those things that helps you to understand. If New England had laws in place that said slavery was legal, why would they have less slaves?
Because it's less poverty.
it's less profitable for them because they're doing things like shipbuilding. They're not growing massive amounts of crops that you need massive amounts of workers. And so it is not as much of an economic profit for them. And so they were based more on yeoman farming, which is where like you go and grow your own little crops that you need personally for your family and a few extra that you can sell. They're not based on this big commercial farming. I think all of you are aware of the difference in subsistence and commercial farming, but just in case, I'll go back through it with you. So subsistence farming is where Papa grows enough crops to eat what he needs to survive. Commercial farming is where you grow hundreds of acres with the intention of that's going to be how you make your money. That's what you do is you sell that. And the majority of it, not the guy who parks on the side of the road with a few extra watermelons, but unless he's like out there every weekend selling hundreds of them, but basically someone who just has enough for personal subsistence. But commercial farming isn't present in New England, really. That's what you're going to see in South Carolina. That's what you're eventually going to see in Mississippi. That's where these big plantations are. And so that is why they go that route. It's more profitable for them. All right. So the Puritans, as we said, codified slavery in 1641, which all that means is they wrote it down. And it's in this one little document. And this one little document just basically says that it doesn't say slavery is legal, but it says slaves could be held if they were captives of war, if they sold themselves into slavery, or if they were purchased from elsewhere, or if they were sentenced to slavery by a governing authority. So prisoners of war, so that means any Native Americans that were captured could be prisoners of war, right? Sold themselves into slavery. Well, that didn't happen. But I think that's why they had that next part. Were purchased elsewhere. Think about how tricky that is. That's saying, oh yeah, so that means if you brought them from Africa, that counts. Or if they were sentenced to slavery by a governing authority. And I would assume that would be like a type of prison sentence, perhaps, maybe. I'm not completely sure about where that one goes from. But anyway, and so this word, instead of referring to them, the people who were sold into slavery as slaves or by racial identification or by Africans, they used the term strangers. So they talked about strangers who were brought and were sold into slavery. And they do that because they're not English subjects. They're kind of wanting to point out that these people are not of English descent. And so eventually colonists came to equate this term with Native and African people. So, all right. So let's talk about New York and New Jersey. New York and New Jersey. The Dutch West India Company. The Dutch West India Company. Now, this is not to be confused with the tea company. What was the tea company called? The one that sent all the tea that gets dumped in the water because it had the discount. East India Company, that's right. And so, yeah, that was the British East India Company that's had the tea that becomes such a part of the famous tea, Boston Tea Party. All right, so New York and New Jersey. So this company is going to introduce slavery in 1625 in the number of 11 individuals. And they're going to come into New York and New Jersey, and they're mainly going to work in farming for 11 people, yes. They're going to be brought into New York City. Now, at the time, it was called New Amsterdam. But for our purposes, we'll just say New York to keep it kind of easy. The Dutch colony that was there is going to eventually expand across the river, the Hudson River, into New Jersey. And so later you do have slaves in that area that were held by private citizens. Although enslaved, this system is going to be a little different in some of its rules than what we're going to see later. The Africans there did have a few basic rights as compared to what we're going to see later in Southern society, slavery. And they also were very kind of geared towards keeping families intact, if at all possible, as far as it seemed to be, unless the families chose to separate, which I thought was very different from what you're going to see a little bit later. And so these people were also admitted to the Dutch Reformed Church. They were married by its ministers, and their children could be baptized. And I think that's also significant to show how it's going to even digress further, because when you get to the Deep South, it was illegal for slaves to marry. And why they did that is that way you didn't say you were separating families when you would sell off people. So slaves could do some other things that I think are very significant for compared to what's coming in the future here. They could testify in court. Any of you remember Dred Scott? If you remember the Dred Scott case, which is going to take place in 1757, I believe, in the Supreme Court, which ruled that slaves were not citizens, therefore they had no legal rights in court, nor could they testify. Slaves could also sign legal documents, and slaves could bring civil actions against non-slave people, aka white people included in that, English citizens. Some were permitted to work and earn wages equal to those paid to white workers. When the colony fell to the English in the 1660s, the company actually freed all of their slaves. And so there is actually a group of free African people that will be in that area from that time. And so obviously slavery would in no way be ideal, but the Dutch at least were somewhat less cruel, we should say. So the English continued to import slaves into New York, and they would provide a wide variety of skills, both skilled and unskilled. In 1703, and of course, you know, I like statistics because I think they give us just kind of a good perception of what's going on. In 1703, according to the census, 42% of New York City's households held slaves. Now, how many? That's not numbers that I have for you, but 42%, that seems high for New York City compared to knowing eventually that there will not be slavery allowed there. A percentage higher than both Boston and Philadelphia, and second only to Charleston. So the only large city that owned more slaves was Charleston. All right, so the Midwest, the Mississippi River, and the Louisiana. The French introduced slavery into their colonies in New France. And after the port of New Orleans was founded in 1708, it had this amazing access to the Gulf Coast. And so the French colonists imported more African slaves so they could use them for agriculture or mining labor. And so by the mid-18th century, 1700s, slaves accounted for as much as 1/3 of the population in that area. So that's a pretty quick jump to 1/3. So 1718, New Orleans is founded, and by the mid-18th century, so the 1750s, 1760s, you have more people, 1/3 of your people are in slavery. So this happens very, very rapidly. Slavery was more extensive in Louisiana than some of these other places because it was here that the French developed sugarcane plantations. The sugarcane plantations. Slavery was maintained by the French, and then the Spanish, even when they had government over that area, and eventually it will be passed on to the American people. And so the first people, of course, they enslaved, this is kind of a trend you see here, were Native Americans. And then eventually you're going to see them import Africans as laborers in their efforts for the colony. Mortality rates are going to be high for really everybody in that area because it is so marshy. You tend to have more diseases and things oftentimes in wet areas. And so they're, especially with mosquitoes carrying them, a lot of the diseases. So this is going to be an implementation. So let's talk a little bit about the Code Noir. Code Noir. So Code Noir is the French laws that regulates the slave trade and slavery in the French colonies. Now, as a result, Louisiana and the Mobile area developed very different patterns of slavery compared to the British colonies. The history of Louisiana and Mobile, to me, are so closely connected in a lot of ways. In fact, I took a really good class when I was doing my graduate degree that was a comparative of the two areas, and it surprised me a lot. course, Mobile, one of Mobile's big things is that they claim to have had the first Mardi Gras. And that's hotly disputed, but they do argue that they definitely had the first Mardi Gras after the Civil War. And so that is where, if you've heard the name Joe Cane Day is the Monday before Mardi Gras. And Joe Cane, was this kind of strange man, and he comes in dressed very weirdly, and he's carrying this stick, and he comes in to kind of like a bar, and he leads this parade of just random people at the bar out around town. And so that's considered to be the first Mardi Gras after the Civil War, and that's why it's called Joe Cane's Day. And there is a big event on the Sunday before Mardi Gras that I've never been to, but it's called the Merry Widows of Joe Cane, where all of these people gather around the grave of Joe Cane. And the story is, when he died, that 3 different women showed up claiming to be his wife, and weren't aware that there were other women who claimed to be his wife. So Joe Cane was a little bit of a interesting individual, but I digress. So these places, you see the Code Noir. The Code Noir gave some rights to slaves, including the right to marry. Again, different from the British. Although, this is the kicker, it authorized corporal punishment. Now, if you're not familiar with the term corporal punishment, basically that means beating. Oftentimes it was used in school before then. Well, it really kind of died out by 2000, but in the term of paddling, but the idea is being punished physically for anything that is considered to be inappropriate. It forbade slave owners to torture slaves or to separate married couples. And also, you could not separate young children from their mothers. It required owners to raise slaves in the Catholic faith. And it implied, despite the fact that they were still using slavery, that Africans were human beings with a soul. And that was something that actually had not been put in writing before this time. So it's kind of the first thing that actually specifically says that. However, it does forbid interracial marriage. The Code Noir does forbid interracial marriage. However, interracial relationships were a part of Louisiana from the earliest years. And in New Orleans society, particularly, a formal system had developed called the plaçage. And it was very, very common. This is Miss Green. I do. Okay. All right, thanks. Your lunchbox is here. Do you want to wait, or do you want to get it now? Okay. All right. And in fact, what would happen is these were usually formed between young white men and African or African American women. These relationships were formalized actually with contracts that included freedom for a woman and her child if she was still enslaved. It would also include education for any children from the union, and sometimes a property settlement. And so free people of color become an intermediate social caste in New Orleans particularly, that was somewhere between the white caste and the mass of enslaved blacks. And many of these people were educated, very well educated. Many of them practiced crafts. And so how many of you have much familiarity with New Orleans? Maybe a little bit. Okay. So I particularly love the city of New Orleans. I find it very interesting. Then we say to enjoy New Orleans, you have to be a foodie. You have to like music, or you have to like history, or you have to be a drunk, and there was another one. I always forget what our last one. And really, we're all of those except for the drunk part. We don't really drink. But what we found so interesting about New Orleans when we started to go over there is we would take different history tours every time. And they're usually pretty accurate. Just because you hear somebody say something that's a tour guide doesn't mean it's always correct. So if it seems weird, look it up. But if you go into New Orleans and you stay south of the interstate, you'll notice all the houses are very colorful, right? They're very bright and they're very colorful. Well, that was what was called Creole Town. And so that's where you would see these young women of color, that they would live who were of mixed race, and that's where they would raise their children. And then if you go north to the Garden District, and you notice how the houses are like just the colors are not as pretty. They're very, very bland. They're just kind of, just normal like beiges and grays and whites and whatever. And it's interesting, but that was more the area of town for the whites. And so you see these distinctions. And then you had, of course, enslaved people did not have their own homes and those kind of things. And so you see these two very different societies. And the other thing that I found interesting is that the cemeteries are the same way. So if you go and tour some of the older cemeteries, I know those of you who have had me in class have heard me talk about Nicolas Cage's grave that's at the cemetery there. And yes, I know Nicolas Cage, but he's actually, well, he's not buried yet, but he acts like he's dead. However, he has in the middle of St. Louis, number 1, there's a big sarcophagus that he has there. And so if you ever go St. Louis Cemetery, number 1, this is the cemetery that was laid out more for people of African descent. And these people were elites. This was like an elite group to get in here. And so it's interesting because that culture is different than anywhere else in the U.S. at that time. And so I find it very, very interesting. If you were interested, this is Nicolas Cage bought a plot there, and that's his. And it's really weird, but he's Nicolas Cage. Now, the other famous grave there, and why I mention it, is this one. Marie Laveau. Many of you ever heard of Marie Laveau? Okay. So she is nicknamed the Voodoo Queen. And so she was one of these ladies of mixed descent. And they did a whole, like, if you ever watched American Horror Stories, which they did one that was centered in New Orleans. Yes. And they would focus back oftentimes. And so people will visit her grave. And because she was believed to be tied to voodoo. And of course, there you see some of the African ancestry there. But the 3 X's is connected to voodoo, and people will leave like all sorts of like offerings there. Like they'll leave like chapstick and all sorts of this weird stuff. And the idea there is that you're visiting her and asking her for a blessing is the idea with that. I'm not real big into voodoo or anything like that, so I don't really get into any of that, but it's interesting. And so this is a very elite, or this is kind of a cemetery of some very elite people. Another name that you might recognize that is buried in this cemetery, and I was trying to see if you could see his, is Homer Plessy. Yeah, this is the stuff they've left at her around there for her blessing. But Homer Plessy, who was the Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson, the case where the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal is legal as long as it's equal, and we know it wasn't equal. Homer Plessy is buried there as well. And so he was actually a descendant from one of those families that was of mixed lineage. And if you remember, if you had my class, I showed you the picture of him. And you could tell he was very light-skinned. And that was obviously why. So anyway, I find that stuff interesting, and I think it's kind of neat. So if you're ever in that area, that you make that connection to it, because it is a part of our history, and it's pretty local. So you do have this social class of free people of color in New Orleans. And so gradually in the English colonies, slavery became known as a racial caste system that encompasses all people of African descent, even if mixed race. In the other ones, not as much in New Orleans, though. It is kind of that one exception. And in fact, you even had outside of New Orleans or Mobile, there were a couple of families that were of mixed lineage that owned slaves. So these were children who had been born to a black mother and a white father, and that were married. And they had taken over the plantation and started their own plantation. And so you do see some interesting things, because that's not common throughout the rest of the South, but just kind of in that area that had belonged to the French. So, all right. So from the 17th century, from the 1600s on, Virginia, the state of Virginia, defines all children who were born to enslaved mothers as slaves themselves, regardless of their father's ancestry. Why is that? So Virginia declares all children born to mothers in slavery to automatically be slaves, no matter.
Because men would always rape the women. Those children. So that you have to claim the children.
That's right. And so think about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and he fathered, I believe, 3 children by Sally. He started, I want to say, she was 15 or 16 when they became involved, and there are different schools of thought. I won't even go down that road, but at any rate, this is, so not only are these women in a situation where the idea of choice may not even be a thing, it's just extremely inappropriate. And so basically they were denied these rights. Virginia also denied the right of converting a slave to Christianity. If they converted to Christianity, they could no longer be free. And so even free people of color or people who were of mixed race were restricted in their rights as compared to previous societies. And so we begin to see these harsher laws. And as the laws got harsher, you begin to see more slave revolts. And so talking about the Atlantic slave trade. So a little bit about the Atlantic slave trade. So of the enslaved Africans brought to the New World, only about 5 to 7% ended up in British North America. Most slaves transported were sent to the Caribbean sugar colonies. And so it's interesting because realistically, like such a small percentage of the people who were taken from Africa are here. Well, that's not true. At this time, most of them really are in those sugar colonies, and that's where they are making sugar cane. Also, large numbers in Brazil and any parts of Spanish America. So, especially in the Caribbean, many of these people are going to be killed off because of the tropical diseases, especially yellow fever and malaria. Also, malnutrition, poor housing, inadequate clothing. And so this number is just astounding to me. Only about 1/4 of the people brought into the sugar colonies are going to survive the miserable conditions and live a normal length of an adult life. That means 3/4 died. And so that should say something about the conditions and how inhumane this was. It was not only these major powers, there were other nations that were participating in the trans-African slave trade, which we will talk about more. Let's talk about sexual role differentiation in slavery a little bit. So there were differences depending on their age and gender. Slaves were assigned to particular tasks that had to be completed during the course of the day. Men usually participated in the harder labor, such as working on the farm in these earlier years. Now we know later that farm work was not uncommon for women either. However, while women generally were more likely to be assigned to the house, they would be sent out on errands, but in the most part, women's jobs were usually spent taking care of tasks that would have been part of the owner's household. And so these are mainly applied more in the northern colonies. Of course, in the southern colonies, however, women and men typically engaged in the same roles, especially in the tobacco fields of Virginia. Although slave men and women in some areas performed the same day-to-day type of work, the female slave was faced with the prospect of being forced into sexual relations for the purpose of reproduction. And so reproduction could be forced, which this just to me has to be like, if there's a worst part, like it has to be the absolute worst part is to violate someone in this way. And so it would either be forced between two slaves, or it could be forced between a slave woman and an owner, which is kind of what we were talking about earlier. And so slave owners basically saw these women as for their fertile bodies. And that meant that, by having children, that would give them this extra offspring. And if you haven't seen, why can I not think of the show? Handmaid's Tale. This makes me think so much of The Handmaid's Tale. and just the way that the women are treated on there, and just how their life is completely maintained to expectation, how they're forced into these relationships for the purpose of creating children. In fact, women who had lots of children were often rewarded for that. And so it becomes a very strong thing. So the more children you produce, and there were even some states that if you produced a certain number of children, you would actually be given your freedom. By the way, the other society that recognizes the multiple production of children and rewards that, does anybody know what group did that?
Wait, what?
There was another group that rewarded having many, many children. If you had a certain number of children, you were recognized.
Anywhere in history?
Anywhere in
Like
history.
Germany.
Yes, Hitler. Hitler rewarded there was a Medal of Honor that was the equivalent to the highest sacrifice a soldier could make. And then there was like a second run or a first runner up, like you're almost there, keep going kind of thing. And if women had that Medal of Honor, and there's a title for it, then a full-grown soldier had to stop and salute her as if she were the highest ranked official because she had produced all of these children for Germany. And so I find it interesting. I'm sure there are other times in history, but those are the two of which I'm aware where women were rewarded for producing lots of children. But I digress. Men were often separated from their families. And because of that, you often see in these slaveholding families the stronger relationship between mother and child, as they denied slave fathers their paternal rights. Biological families were separated in times for sale. The best bet of a family staying together is if they were all on the same plantation. And so usually large plantations had less mobility like that because the less stable people are, the more likely they are to freak out. And families that consisted of two parents and children there is a natural thing to want to protect your children. And so sometimes you will let some things go, but if they started separating families, and so they would separate, but generally that was more common on the smaller plantations than the large. And so most interestingly enough, many slaves were actually raised in two-parent households, which that statistic kind of surprised me. I read that semi-recently, and it was kind of a surprise to me.
Yeah, I saw a video that it is like basically because this girl was explaining like racist stereotypes that like went back to slavery and saying that this is why like the stereotype that that black men don't stay with their family like a lot because they like they
It's proliferated.
Yeah.
And stereotypes are that. They are stereotypes, but this was something, when you think about in that era, those families were not respected. They were not respected. And so even like we said, it was illegal to marry, but how many of you have ever heard of jumping the broom? Okay, so like 3 of us, 4 of us. All right. So this was a common practice with people in slavery because since you could not legally marry, this became a sign. So they would have like a lot of times a little ceremony with their friends, and they would go out and they would commit in a relationship to each other, and they would jump the broom, and that would be kind of like taking that step of being married. And their vow to each other was usually until death or sale do us part. And just the trauma of that, till death or sale. So we're committed until one of us die or until one of us gets sold off, and then and so it's. There is a certain amount of that stereotype that is definitely blown out of proportion from that area, but it's just those men being jerked away. And, yeah. But anyway, some historians basically suggest that indentured servanthood kind of provided a model for slavery. Indentured servants, though, basically they were teenagers. And a lot of times their fathers would sell their labor voluntarily for a period of time, like especially if they had several children. And so this would usually be around 7 years. And so then for that amount, that child would be able to come to the New World and they would pay their passage. However, they had to work for whomever had purchased their passage for that time. But at the end of that time, they were freed. They also could not be beaten. I actually wrote that out, that you could not beat your indentured servants. And so when people compare the two, I kind of cringe because that's not a real comparison. But in return for passage, room and board, clothing, training, and occupation, and afterwards they gave you cash. And you didn't get paid like for all those years of work, but they also paid for your trip. So they basically, it's like going off to boarding school, you know, and also you would get clothing and tools and land, and then you would become just an ordinary settler. In fact, I have an ancestor, one of my cousins that did some genealogy. We actually had a family member who was an indentured servant at Jamestown somewhere way back, whenever, that didn't die. We're resilient. So it's kind of amazing because if you remember Jamestown, almost everybody dies, right? And so cousin whomever did not. But there's a total difference in that, because after that point, that young man was able to like start his life. You know, if he had kids, they weren't automatically slaves. And so it's, to compare the two, I think is kind of offensive, if nothing else. And so let's talk about rebellion. So the Stono Rebellion is the probably least known slave rebellion, but it's, interestingly enough, one of the most successful. So the leader of the Stono Rebellion is an individual by the name of Jimmy. And Jimmy here is not spelled like how you typically see Jimmy spelled. It is spelled with an E. And so Jimmy was taken, it's believed, from the Kingdom of the Congo. And many other enslaved people had this similar background. And so what's going to happen is, because he had been introduced to Catholicism and some other things, he was able to communicate with the other enslaved people. And so they started to work together to resist their enslavement and to try to keep slave people from these communities. And so what actually is going to happen with them is they're going to rebel. They're going to be joined, it tells you here, by 40 to 60 more people. They march about 15 miles, and they killed at least 20 white people. They do spare some, so it's kind of interesting. It's not just let's kill every white person we find kind of thing. It was kind of targeted to specific people. The rebellion ends, basically they're caught. They kill at least 34 of them. Some of them manage to escape and retreat. And basically what ends up happening is, after this, there is a much stricter slave code put in place in reacting to that. And those slave codes, of course, were in place until the Civil War is going to come to an end. That particular slave code is going to bring us, the particular slave code, is called the Negro Act of 1740. And so that is dramatically going to change history. It implies limits on enslaved people's behavior. They could no longer assemble. Get this one like shocked me. They could no longer grow their own food. Why?
Because they didn't want them to be strong.
Okay. Well, yes, but these are for people who are our slaves. They wanted to.
It seemed like it's some type of reward, like being able to
Maybe.
turn food.
My thought is it was a controlling aspect, because then you had to get your food. You're dependent. And so it's to limit you from having that extra freedom. It also, they could not learn how to write. So this is when the reading and writing comes in. And they could not travel freely. And so you see these huge changes after the Stono Rebellion. I do also want to point out the Stono Rebellion is before we ever become a nation. And so that is why once we see slavery develops in the South, it is so much harsher, is because they had already set those codes in place. And you don't have another rebellion that is that successful. And so it's kind of like, well, that works, so we're going to keep doing it, is the idea that goes with it. All right, so let's talk about what happens after this. So we have, this is talking about the different rules here. Yeah, that act. All right. So let's talk about New York. The New York conspiracy trials of 1741. 18th century New York contained many different types of people. And so 1 in 5 New York people were enslaved at this time. And because of this, there was very high tension between enslaved people and the free population, especially after the Stono Rebellion. And so after the Stono Rebellion, when several white people were killed, the tension kind of amps up. People become afraid. And so that year, 13 different fires break out in the city of New York. Now, considering the houses are all made of wood and they're close together, I'm sure that wasn't that uncommon. One reduced a particular colony called Fort George, the fort, to nothing but ashes. And so basically, the city's white population starts spreading this rumor. Now, not sure where the rumor actually initiated completely. However, we know how rumors work, right? People become, I mean, if you have no better example, just with all of the recent fears and things that, you know, the rumors, I call it wars and rumors of wars that have been going on in our country. And so basically, the white population spread the rumors that the fires were part of a massive slave revolt and that it was part of a goal to murder white people, burn the city, and take over the colony. So they decided that all of the slaves there in New York were just going to burn it down and kill all the white people and take it over. Now, again, they're looking at the Stono Rebellion just a few years back in the rearview mirror. And so this starts to scare them. And so the nervous British, interrogate almost 200 enslaved people and accuse them of this big conspiracy. They also think that the Roman Catholics have joined in an attempt to murder the Protestants. So, I mean, do you see how ridiculous these things start to sound? But when people live in the middle of these things, they believe them. And so they start thinking, oh my gosh, all these slaves are wanting to kill us. And they've joined together with the Catholic Church and the Catholics and the slaves. And yeah. And so anyway, it starts to create general hysteria. Very quickly, the 200 were arrested, including a large number of the city's enslaved population. Some were not slaves, but most of them were. After a few quick trials, known as the New York Conspiracy Trials, the government executed the British government, 17 New Yorkers. I just want that to kind of, 17 New Yorkers. From what we can tell with little to no actual evidence or proof, 13 men of color were burned at the stake, while the others, including 4 white men, were hanged. 70 enslaved people of color were sold to the West Indies. Sadly, as I said, almost nothing exists to prove that this was actually a conspiracy or a real thing. But it does illustrate how deadly the racial divide in British America was when the colonies began to become fearful, and how willing they were to repress the enslaved people if they thought they were in danger. And so on that very ugly, dark chapter is where we will end our Friday for today. As far as our notes, for those of you at the blood drive, drink lots of juice. Bye-bye.